Mistaken for a driver, this billionaire takes the maid home, and what he did next changed everything. The words could have been a headline. In the moment, they were nothing more than a cut through Na Brooks's small, steady life. Sharp, public, unforgettable. The vase hit the marble with the sound a coin makes when it drops through still air and never lands where you expect. Crystal fractured into 1,000 tiny mirrors that scattered across the foyer like a confession. The guests on the other side of the French doors froze, their laughter stuck halfway out. A chandelier trembled. Somewhere a glass chimed as if to punctuate the humiliation. Na was stooped at the end of the long table, her hands still scrubbed in lemon-scented soap, the sleeves of her uniform damp from polishing brass. She had been moving through the room the way she always did, quiet, efficient, careful. When Janine stepped forward wrong-footed, a wine glass in hand, and the vase tipped under a sleeve that flicked air like a whip. In that instant, Janine's face rearranged itself from fluster to accusation. "They said she did it," Mr. Lancaster's voice said, more statement than question. It seemed to echo off the marble and into Na's bones. Na's first thought was practical. The vase might be salvageable. There were still pieces whole enough to be glued. Her second was the hollow ache in her palm where a heel had caught her as she tried to steady herself, a deliberate, careless stomp that had left skin torn and red. $15,000, Janine announced, as if rehearsing the price could turn it into proof. 15,000. It was her. There was a calculus the household ran when trouble came. The cleaners, the waitstaff, the ones who moved through rooms like ghosts, were held to standards that rarely cut both ways. Na had been a worker at the Lancaster estate for 3 years. She knew the pattern. Few questions when the rich broke, immediate culpability when the poor didn't perfectly vanish. Still, the first time someone called her clumsy in a home of polished wood and climate-controlled gardens, it landed like a blow. Na tried to speak. Her voice was small against the polished timbre of the guests. I didn't. She had to swallow to keep the sound from breaking. Her hand throbbed, a red smear on the back of her palm where the heel had crushed her. Janine, who had always liked to keep her nails immaculate and her sentences sharper, planted a heel squarely on Na's fingers then, just to make the point broader, and did not look down when Na hissed, bandaging her hand with the napkin as if a dish towel could make a broken thing whole. Mr. Lancaster did not ask if Na had an explanation. He only asked a question about loss and restitution, and what the household would do about it. Janine spoke on, vivid and sure. A woman in a gown clapped a napkin to a face. Someone else carried a broken shard away like removing a bone.
Na's uniform, once crisp, looked suddenly like an accusation in itself. They escorted her out, the estate's long driveway a measured descent toward the public world, where the neighborhood's cracked sidewalks met a line of tall jacaranda trees, purple crowns that were too young to hide everything. Na kept her head down. Her shoes were gone. One heel had broken earlier in the night on uneven stone, and she walked barefoot on the gravel, each step collecting dust and pebbles that made her wince. Blood found the channel between her toes, where the heel had split skin and formed a streak on the light of the pavement. The news of a $15,000 vase seemed to follow like a shadow. Someone pocketed the receipt. Someone else made a note of names. She was given her meager wages and folded bills, told she could collect the rest of her things from the closet next week. Janine smiled the way someone smiles at another person's misfortune, an expression made for cameras. Mr. Lancaster's lawyer, a buttoned man with a voice like a coin, said words that made Na feel smaller. Claims, liability, replacement. On the curb, Na gathered herself as people already moved on to dessert and the rest of their lives. She was barefoot, bleeding, and furious at a world that had been calibrated not to hear the complaints of people like her. The heat of embarrassment pressed into her cheeks. Then, at the end of the drive, in the wash of suburban streetlights and the occasional hum of a passing car, a black Escalade idled. At first she thought, as most people do when they have been thrown out of something bigger than themselves, that the waiting car was another world, a driver delivering a note, a taxi keyed for someone else. The man behind the wheel watched her with a steady patience that felt almost dangerous because it refused to rush. He wore a plain coat, expensive but unobtrusive, and his hands were clean in a way that suggested he had not been involved in the evening's theater. He opened the rear door without a question. "Need a ride?" he asked. His voice was low, an unassuming note that did not demand explanation. Na had learned not to accept favors. People who gave them money, rides, pity, often expected something in return deeper than the help. She hesitated. In the gutter, a bottle cap caught the light like a tiny moon. Her hand was wrapped in a napkin that had already been smudged with dust and blood. "You can't go home like this, Miss Brooks," the man said. He didn't ask for her first name like it was an entitlement. He used it, Na, like a small deliberate recognition. "There's a clinic on 3rd, and I can take you." She thought he was a driver. It was the only role his car could have, seen from the angle of the driveway under the glow of security lamps. The idea that this man might be anything more was not equipment in the city's dictionary. The rich were always either too busy or too far away.
She slid into the back seat, and he closed the door, the sound hushed and final. The ride was almost wordless at first. The Escalade moved through the Jacaranda Avenue with a hum that swallowed the night's residual laughter. Inside, the leather smelled faintly of citrus and something old, like a library. The man offered a bottle of water, the cap twisting under his fingers with an ease that suggested he had done kind things before and found no headlines troubling him. "What happened?" he asked, finally. It was not a demand dressed up as concern. It was an honest question that let Na name the wound. She told him about Janine's heel and the vase and the word 15,000, which kept returning like an ominous tide. She told him, between pauses in sharp economical sentences, about Delilah, her mother, who had always taught her to walk through doors that might close on you, about small, steady incomes, about the rent that never seemed to make room for itself, and about the girls down the block who looked to her sometimes as if she might know how to pull them out of the smallness of what had been offered to them. The man listened. He did not offer advice. He did not recite the kind of platitudes that have the sound of polished veneers. He inquired instead, soft, curious, and let Na hold something like a voice. There was a dignity in that listening that had been absent in the foyer. For Na, who had been trained to make herself vanish when the room demanded, this quiet attention felt like the rarest currency. "Delilah Brooks," he said when she mentioned her mother, as if the name itself had weight. "I know the name." Na's breath stuck. She had not expected that. "You do?" "Only from papers," he said, lagging his words, careful. "From a history someone once sent me about community organizers in Baton Rouge. Your mother, was mentioned. Delilah Brooks had been something like wind in Na's memory, a woman who moved through block parties with a clipboard and a laugh that could soften an argument, a woman whose name was spoken at church fundraisers, and whose faith in people's capacity to organize felt like a small insistence. Delilah's death had been quiet and lonely. Na had buried her with hands that trembled and a heart that refused to be braced. To have the name lifted by someone who otherwise belonged to a world where names were inventories and not legacies made Na feel both exposed and seen. They stopped at the clinic on 3rd. A young nurse eyed Na's bandaged hand and frowned. With a roll of gauze, she cleaned the wound more thoroughly than Janine had when she had clapped a napkin to it like a performance. The man, who for the time being remained a man with a polite, unspectacular car, kept a watchful silence. When the nurse suggested ice and stitches and some time off work, Na's anxiety became practical. How to pay, how to tell
Lancaster, she wouldn't be coming back. How to explain a story to people who already had their version. Back in the car, he asked where she lived. She named the block where her rent-cheap apartment squatted under a sagging porch light. He navigated the roads as if he knew them, but he did not speak about himself beyond the few sentences necessary to get them through the night. A name, Isaiah, and a place that sounded like it could belong in either a newspaper or a private life. He told her he had a small involvement in a neighborhood program not far from where she lived, that he sometimes drove people there to volunteer, to check in. "I'm not a driver," he said, with an easy, almost rueful smile. "But sometimes I drive." Na laughed once, the sound brittle. The world had been trying all night to make her invisible. A man who might have been a driver, who listened and did not speak over her, offered, without pomp, a small string of resources. The clinic had a sliding scale policy. The community program might take volunteers. Someone there might be able to help with a reference. It was not charity, a spectacle. It was a geography of minor possibilities that felt to Na like a map. As the car pulled up to her building, a 2-story row house with paint flaking like old promises, Na felt that peculiar mix of relief and shame that clings to survival. The porch light flickered irrespective of the Escalade's headlights. He opened the door for her, and for a second his hands were simply polite, like any man's hands at a door. She watched him but still assumed a driver role, someone paid to open the world for other people and then to stay in his place. He did not stay, though. He waited until she had shuffled inside and until she had leaned against the doorframe. Then he reached into the glove compartment and handed her a plain envelope. "If you need anything else, you can call the number inside," he said. Na turned the envelope over. Inside was a card with Isaiah Collins printed in small, unpretentious type and a number. The card sat like a small, unadorned acknowledgement, a name given without spectacle.
She wanted to refuse it, to fold it and put it in the drawer with all the other pieces of a life people had tried to fix, but his eyes were patient. "Use it if you like," he said. She put it in her back pocket because it felt safer there than in the glove compartment, because she had learned to carry future things where they would be hidden from quick hands. When she closed her door, the street was quiet, safe for the tumble of that evening. Backlit palms, the soft hiss of sprinklers, and a dog that barked once and then stopped. She sat on the edge of the musty couch with her hand wrapped in clean gauze and thought of Delilah's face, the weathered strong mouth that had taught her how to set a table and how to stand when a room demanded less of you than you were.
She traced the name Isaiah with her thumb through the fabric of her pocket and felt the card like a small, unauthorized hope. If this moved you, like and share. Someone nearby might need to hear this. It was a small ask, stupidly timed, but it felt like the only honest action to tag on to a night that had been stripped of so many others. After all, the smallest amplifications could sometimes reach the most crucial ears. In the days that followed, the world kept its shape. Na went back to life as one must. She cleaned houses, took the occasional evening shift at the diner, answered the same calls of condescending civility with the practiced politeness that had kept her paid and fed. But the card sat in her wallet like a foreign coin. She did not call Isaiah Collins. The world had taught her that a single kindness did not buy anyone loyalty, and that networks of favors often had fine print. She learned to test the temperature of offers. He did not vanish. That was what unsettled her most. On a wet Tuesday, a black Escalade slowed at the light by the corner bodega and waited until she stepped out with her grocery bag. He asked if she'd like to come by an evening to meet some people at the community place he mentioned then, a small rented storefront with spray-painted windows and a sagging awning that read, barely legible, "Community Works." "You can volunteer?" he said, and it sounded more like a hopeful question than a request. Na almost said no. She had learned to weigh the cost of every doorway. Then she thought of Lena, a 15-year-old who lived 2 doors down and who had been at the grocery with her that morning. Lena's fingers were full of bruises that looked like a language of worry. She thought of the girls on her block who had fewer adults to call than wrong numbers, of the elderly neighbor whose food often cooled untouched. She thought too of Delilah's small army of printed flyers and block meetings, and how those had never been about saving anyone, but arranging for a place where people could save themselves. She said yes. The community storefront smelled of coffee and old paint. Inside, volunteers moved like the bones of a thing being rebuilt, unhurried, purposeful. There were bookshelves filled with donations, one shelf for novels, another for out-of-date encyclopedias, a third with art supplies. A chalkboard listed programming, after-school tutoring, a job readiness workshop, a Saturday sewing circle for women who wanted to learn alterations instead of underpaid overtime. A battered kettle sang on a small hot plate. Plants leaned toward the sunlight that found its way through the dusty front window. Na's first shift involved a simple, stubbornly useful chore, sorting donated laptops and cataloging their serial numbers. It was work you could see to the end of, and the small victories, a battery that charged, a screen that lit, felt like clean little triumphs. People stopped to talk to her.
A woman named Marta, who ran the volunteer program, had a way of measuring people with her eyes that did not seek to reduce them to past mistakes. She offered Na a cup of coffee and a clipboard, and the dignity of an appointment. Isaiah lingered on the edge of that evening, present without dominating, offering suggestions, carrying heavy boxes when hands were needed. He sat in the corner more often than not, listening. He listened to the stories about who came to the center, the women trying to finish GEDs, the men learning to fix washing machines, the boys who needed a place to learn keyboarding, and when he spoke, it was to ask thoughtful questions that refused to center himself. Na began to hear his name more often. Someone would say, "Isaiah brought the printer. Isaiah connected us with a teacher for Saturday math." The man who had seemed to drive her started to look more like an intersection, a place where different things and people met. But he did not show up in glossy checks or staged photos. When a reporter came once asking for a quote about philanthropy, Isaiah declined being quoted. He sent an email, quietly, that helped a grant application find its way through a tangle of forms. That, for Na, felt right. The man offered help and then stepped back. He seemed to understand a truth Delilah had lived by. The people most worthy of leading a community are not those who parachute in with headlines, but those who stand beside it until they know its soil. The center, in small increments, began to take on a life that swore it would be more than a series of handouts. Na found herself arriving early, moving through tasks with a concentration that startled her.
She worked on a mural plan one afternoon with Marta and a handful of volunteers. A tree whose roots spilled down a wall, names written there in the curling script of those who had built the neighborhood in small, stubborn acts. Delilah's house, someone suggested, half laughing, half serious. The name settled over Na like a load she was built honored and scared to bear. People will remember her, Marta said, rolling out a strip of pencil sketches. They'll come here and see her name and know there was a woman who fought for things that don't show up on a balance sheet. Na touched the paper, the image of Delilah, no longer just a memory in a kitchen, but a figure with a name on a wall, made something inside tighten and expand. Rise and root, she heard herself say, the phrase arriving like it had been waiting on her tongue. We help people plant and grow. We help them rise and root. It was a small mission, 2 verbs that felt like an argument against the sort of despair that made people believe they were too small to change a thing. Na wrote the words down in a cheap notebook she carried for grocery lists and schedules. The phrase felt decisive enough to attract a plan. Not everything that followed was neat. With visibility came noise.
An envelope with a smear of grease was left on the center steps one night. A slur painted across a storage shed 2 blocks over jutted like a warning. Someone anonymous called the number listed on the center's temporary webpage and left a string of threats about meddling in other people's business. Na's heart, which had become used to being vigilant, started to race in new registers. She was not alone. The neighborhood responded the way neighborhoods do when the stake is local and sharp. People rallied, and they did so in informal, stubborn formations. They gathered to repaint the mural after it was defaced, covering hate speech with roots and names and handprints. Marta organized contact lists and scheduled shifts. Mrs. Whitlow, the retired guidance counselor who had known Delilah years before, stood at the center's desk some mornings wearing a cardigan that smelled like mint and offering to lead a weekly circle for teens. Detective Shaw Palmer, a neighborhood liaison, met with Na to discuss a string of vandalism calls, promising follow-ups, and administrative word that felt at once reassuring and inadequate. There were pressures from outside, too. A man with a neat card and a softer voice, one of Lancaster's associates, slid an official-looking letter under the center's door one afternoon, a thinly veiled warning about association and reputational risk. The card's arrival felt like a hand placed on the blade of a knife. Na folded the letter without giving it the ceremonial fury it deserved. She did not like the idea that her name, her mother's legacy, the small energy of people who had gathered, could be bracketed in polite legal threats. Isaiah's face hardened the first time those letters arrived. He moved through the center less like a visitor and more like someone who had been given a corner to hold. He suggested cameras and discreet security checks. He sat in meetings with people who spoke in attorney sounds, and he quietly made calls that moved things through channels Na did not know existed. Yet whenever anyone praised him, he redirected the attention to the volunteers in the neighborhood. He would say, "This is not my project," in a voice that refused to let him be the star of any story. When Na asked him one evening over cups of reheated tea why he did so much and yet kept out of the picture, he offered a small, weary smile. "I've watched too many programs." He paused, looking at the mural sketches. "They come in loud and they leave louder. I want to help where people stay." Those words could have been enough, but they were not heaven-sent absolution. Na had learned to demand clarity. "What do you want, Isaiah?" she asked. "What's the end game?" His answer was that he wanted to be useful. It was not a tidy answer, and it did not try to be.
For someone who could have made a headline with a voucher or a brick of cash, his strategy was quieter. Board meetings, quiet checks, introductions to people who had the quiet power to say yes to forms and grants. He offered to sit in on a meeting with a local funder named Whitman, a man who had supported small initiatives for years, and who apparently remembered Delilah's name from a past life of neighborhood activism. Na agreed to the meeting out of a mixture of curiosity and caution. She wanted resources, but she also wanted to keep her own voice in the center's governance. She had seen patrons who thought a kind heart brought ownership. She would not let that happen. The Whitman meeting was held in a room that still smelled faintly of varnish and paper, an office that had seen years of modest philanthropy. Mr. Whitman was older than his name led one to expect, with hair like iron wool and an impatience softened only by a lifetime of watching small things grow. He asked about Delilah. He asked with no small interest about the mural and about why Na and the team had chosen the name Rise and Root. "You named it after her?" he asked, as if offering a guess. Na told him about Delilah's life as best she could. The flyers, the late-night meetings, the way Delilah had taught neighborhood children to read with the same patience she had used to press church bulletins into order. She spoke with no flourish, with the quiet clarity she had used inside many kitchens where her work was to produce orders and solutions. Her words landed in the room the way stones sink to the bottom of a pond. They made small rings out of men in suits. Whitman listened. He pulled folders from his drawer and leafed through them with a deliberate slowness. "There's a grant we fund," he said. "A small one, to be sure, but it's the kind that helps you retrofit a building, get some chairs that won't collapse in a week, and install some reliable internet. If Delilah's name is going on it, we'll want to see her story in ink. Archives, letters, testimony." Na felt an ache there, sharp with a mixture of pride and survival panic. Delilah's story was folded into the backs of grocery receipts and the margins of church minutes. Na did not have neat archives. She had a box of papers, a photograph with the flash burned out in the middle, and a memory bank maintained by people whose names changed like weather. "Give me time," she said. "If this is what you need, I'll find it." Whitman nodded. "Take your time," he said, but he did not use the casual cadence of someone unconcerned. He underlined for Na that the grant would be competitive and that the board would want specifics. He wanted a mission statement. He wanted a budget. He wanted a narrative that would make strangers care. The task should have been impossible. Na had grown up where mission statement meant getting 3 meals a day and making sure the learning didn't stop at the end of the bell.
Yet the urgency of the letter, an opportunity with a deadline, gave birth to a fierce practicality. She began, with Marta and a couple of volunteers, to draft what Rise and Root might offer that others did not. After-school tutoring with transportation vouchers, job skills workshops that came with real connections to hiring managers, a girls' mentorship program named for Delilah's belief that girls who had someone to listen to them could find a different path. There were nights she sat at the cold kitchen table with the card Isaiah had given her tucked under her elbow, writing mission statements that sounded too formal for a room where people tended to coffee and offered kindness without a line item. She called Mrs. Whitlow for advice about structuring youth programs. She spoke to Luis, a contractor who had once patched a neighbor's ceiling, about what it would take to make an old storefront weatherproof. Each phone call was an act of faith, and each person who stayed on the line for longer than convenience asked that she be more than an anecdote. Then the first real test came in the form of a smear, one of those tiny, cruel social media posts that had the capacity to metastasize. Someone had sent a photo taken out of context, Janine from the Lancaster party standing behind Na at the community table, with a caption that insinuated Na had been collecting on sympathy since the night of the vase. People who liked louder things reposted it and added their own judgments. Volunteers texted Na with worried hearts. Someone demanded the center distance itself from Na until an investigation was done. Na could have folded. She could have stepped out and let another person's opinion define her. Instead, she walked into the center one morning with the picture printed in her hand and a list of programs she would not let go of. She refused to believe that a compound of half-truths should move a community built on whole people. That was the point where she began to learn how to lead. She stood before a room of volunteers and neighbors with the printed smear and said only what she had to, that she had been accused and humiliated, that the photograph did not tell the story of her life, that the center had never been about her alone, and then simply what the next week's schedule looked like. She let the small acts of organization answer the larger questions. People came together. They repainted the defaced wall that week, their hands sticky with paint and determined so the names beneath the roots might be legible again. Mothers who had never spoken in a meeting before brought homemade food to the volunteers, and teenagers scrubbed graffiti with a focus that Na cried quietly into her sleeve as she worked. The center began to look less like a project and more like a place in which people had the right and the muscle to defend what they built.
In the quiet between the storms, Na found herself thinking of that night at the Lancaster estate, of the sound of glass against stone, of Janine's heel. She thought of Isaiah opening the Escalade's door, like someone who understood that the simplest courtesy could be a hinge. The man had not barged in. He had offered presence, and then, when the center needed an opening, a way through. The name Billionaire hovered in the background of conversations, used more as clickbait than as an instruction. In the gossiping corners of the neighborhood, people called him a billionaire, as if that one adjective could explain his 2 hands and his patient questions. Na did not need the title to trust that his money could fix things. Money could. What she measured was the way he handed it, silently, with a backhand toward autonomy. That was the real surprise, the thing that shocked everyone more than the idea of a wealthy man opening a door for a maid, that power could be arranged so that it amplified rather than eclipsed. Still, power had its complications. A delivery of refurbished laptops arrived one morning, large boxes with the stenciled name of a grant partner, and with it came a reporter who wanted to tell a story about heroes and rescues. Na declined to be turned into someone's uplifting anecdote. She would not let a local narrative be harvested for someone else's weekend column. The reporter left with good photos of the mural and an interview with Marta instead, an image he could run that did not flatten Na into a single night.
The article that followed put the spotlight on the volunteers and mentioned the names of the girls who had received tutoring. It did not wrap the story in a neat before and after bow. There were small victories, a promise from Whitman that might become a modest grant, the arrival of an intake form for Delilah's house, with lines for names and hopes and the indication that someone in the office had read Delilah's name and remembered. But there were also new dangers. An arson scare, just a scraped mailbox and charred paper, but vivid enough, left the volunteers jittery. Someone slashed the center's tires one night. The threats that had once been whispers found louder mouths. Na did not flinch outwardly. She organized a watch, she pushed the neighborhood to stay visible and calm, and she sat with Detective Shaw Palmer in a small interrogation room that smelled of cleaning product and determination. The detective was practical, a man who smiled rarely and listened more than he asked questions. He promised to follow leads, to log the incidents. "We'll try to be thorough," he said. "We won't let it slide." Yet there were nights now read the sounds of the neighborhood as if they were portents. Once the center's rear door was forced, a log pried open as if to remind everyone that resistance had a cost. The volunteers cleaned up quietly in the morning, refusing to perform outrage for cameras.
Na refused to let panic be the center's primary response. She chose instead to hold meetings, to teach the girls how to document incidents, to create a plan that moved people from fear to action. The more she acted, the more a name began to fit around her like a garment. Leader. It was a label she had not sought. It held the weight of responsibility. When Whitman's office asked for a formal application, Na and Marta sat up late into the night, drafting budgets and schedules and a narrative of Delilah's work that would satisfy funders without turning her into a relic. The story was messy. Na's hands were scarred from scrubbing just as they were calloused from holding a pen. People argued about how to allocate funds, a computer lab or a counselor, a full-time director or more security. Each choice bared a value. Safety or autonomy, presence or protection. Na learned to listen, to weigh, to decide. Her mother's lessons had not been prescriptive, but insisting. You listen, you plan, you act. By the time the grant proposal was submitted, a modest packet of hope bound in a folder, someone had begun to whisper. The Escalade was no longer just a car. In the neighborhood's quieter conversations, the label billionaire had evolved from a curious adjective to a charged metaphor. People were unsettled not because Isaiah had given money, because money is obvious, but because he had asked to be invisible. It complicated things. It forced Na, often uncomfortably, to reckon with trust and gratitude and the uneasy arithmetic power imposes on relationships. And yet, even as threats sharpened and fundraising dinners raised eyebrows upstairs from where the center's children learned to type, there was a new soft sound taking shape. The laughter of girls who had once sat in laundromats during summer days and now were learning coding basics. There were mothers who had begun to attend a night class on household budgeting. There was a mural that was, inch by inch, being made into a map of names and roots that would not be scrubbed clean easily by old forces. On a humid, late afternoon, Na stood before the jelly bean-colored wall where the roots of the painted tree had begun to curl into names. She held a rolled-up piece of paper, an early draft of the mission statement, and she thought about the woman who had stood with a clipboard and a megaphone. Delilah's name pulsed at the center of the design like a hidden heartbeat. She had not yet accepted any title, nor had she agreed to leave the small neighborhood that had taught her to love and be brave. The work ahead was both exhilarating and terrifying. Outside, an Escalade idled at the curb, the same car that had once seemed merely a vehicle and had, in the last months, become shorthand for something larger. A man like Isaiah Collins stepped out and joined the volunteers in painting a faint line along the roots, his sleeves rolled up as if the paint could stain him into a partnership rather than make him an owner. Na watched him for a moment, and then she picked up a brush and dipped it into blue. She did not need him to put her name on a program. She did not want to be the anecdote that finished a story. She wanted to be the person who turned a broken piece of their world into a place that unfurled into possibility. The work of putting those words onto a wall, rise and root, Delilah's house, felt like setting a boundary and an invitation. Roots, not rescue. They painted until the light fell, and the mural glowed soft in the dusk. They left the red streaks where graffiti had once been, not as scars to hide, but as proof that the neighborhood could endure and rewrite what it had been told about itself. People left with paint under their nails and names pressed into their memory like promises. But the air had changed. The simple presence of the man who had once been a driver became a fulcrum. His quiet involvement that amplified rather than diminished Na was itself provocative. Some in the neighborhood welcomed it, others feared it. When a late-night call came to Na's phone, one of those anonymous things that promise harm if you don't step back, the screen showed an unknown number. She looked at the mural in the morning light, at the faces she had learned to lead, and felt the pressure of a decision she had to make soon. Should she accept the grant Whitman had hinted at and let the center expand in ways it had not yet imagined? Or should she keep the organization small, grassroots, more vulnerable, but also more independent? The choice would not be simple. It would require a reckoning with what Delilah had stood for and what the neighborhood needed now. As Na folded her dirty clothes into a bag and headed home that evening, the card in her back pocket warmed against her hip. Isaiah had driven away without fanfare. Whoever he was, the public's imagination would fill in the blanks. For Na, none of that changed the simple truth that a man opened a door for her that night, not because he expected a story, but because he recognized a human being. She kept that recognition like a talisman, not an end. The next morning, the world would bring new challenges. A reporter asking for a profile, a volunteer ready to step down after threats escalated, a contractor who wanted a down payment. The story had begun, but it was not done. The ride that started in a driveway, taken for what looked like a driver, would ripple in ways neither of them could have predicted. The quiet kindness of an opened car door had become a lever. The question now was how to use it without being used. As the sun slid down the avenue and the jacarandas turned purple against the sky, Na traced the mural's roots with her fingertips. Somewhere inside the neighborhood, a window clicked shut. Somewhere else, a man who had been mistaken for a driver called a number in a small card and left a message that read less like instruction and more like readiness.
The rest would require more than a card and a humble car. It would require courage, the slow organizing of neighbors, and a willingness to stand in the way when others decided to burn bridges. Night deepened. Na washed her hands and wrapped the last strip of gauze around her fingers with a steadiness she did not feel, then set the roll of tape down and sat at her tiny kitchen table with the card from Isaiah folded in her palm like a small, improbable talisman. Outside, a siren sighed somewhere far off and then died. Inside, the house kept its modest, patient sounds: pipes, the hum of an ancient refrigerator, the soft scrape of paint against a window frame when the wind found it right. She thought of the mural and of the volunteers who had stayed even after the smear post went viral for a day and then was buried under whatever new outrage the internet required. She thought of Delilah's voice, the small insistence that people could learn to run toward a thing instead of always away. Early the next week, a letter arrived like weather. Whitman's office, on headed paper, enclosed a short note and folded inside the official application packet for a community grant. It was the kind of small bureaucracy that could be the hinge between a program that existed in goodwill and one that paid a utility bill. Marta squealed when she saw it, quietly, as one might at the sight of a bird that had somehow returned to a windowsill. Na felt something like vertigo and then a fierce, practical calm. This was work for which she would need other people.
She read notes aloud to Marta, who listened like a woman who had learned to be a constant, and in the small spaces between cities, Na felt something rearrange. The narrative of her mother was not merely domestic diligence, it was a accrual of civic courage. In Baton Rouge, she found an archive that smelled of dust and lemon oil, and the patient architecture of local history. There were minutes from a neighborhood association dated 25 years back, a clipping from a weekly paper about a sit-in Delilah had organized at a landlord's office, and a flyer, thin, hand-typed, offering free childcare for parents attending a meeting on housing rights. Na held the brittle paper and tasted something like vindication and sorrow at once. Delilah had not been merely beloved. She had kept a record of stubborn claims against eviction notices and had taught neighbors how to stand behind petitions like a chorus that would not be ignored. One afternoon, in the quieter stacks, Na found a short oral history interview, transcribed and typed in a careful hand. The speaker, an older woman who had worked with Delilah, described late-night meetings lit by votive candles, lists of contacts, and a small eviction blockade where milk crates and pots had been used as barricades. Delilah's name threaded through the pages like a litmus strip. There was a moment in the tape when the woman laughed at the memory and then sobered. "She taught us to count our numbers," she said, meaning people, yes, but also the small ways a community could be numerically organized into a force. Na pressed her hand flat to the paper, as if the letters could transmit warmth. She brought photocopies back to Whitman's office in a manila folder. Whitman read them with a gravity that softened something in his face. "This," he said, tapping the printout, "is what we need." He offered then and there the language of a grant letter, archival surname, a confirmed mission, community letters of support. He supplied a list of referees and an invitation to a site visit. The grant, if approved, would be small, enough for furniture, internet, some stipends for part-time staff, and a reliable security system. It would not solve everything, but it would make the center sustainable in a way ad hoc donations could not. Back home, the centers of life moved in overlapping circles. The Neighborhood's Watch, organized by Marta with Na's direct encouragement, had taken on a dignity that was not performative. People committed to 2-hour shifts of presence at night. Mrs. Whitlow taught a sea of young girls the art of responding to direct questions with clear facts for police reports. They made incident logs with dates, times, and witnesses' names. Na learned to write her own name on a form without shrinking. Each signature was a stake in the ground. Not everyone accepted the change quietly. Janine's presence in the story was a slow, corrosive note.
She continued to appear in little ways, a comment on a neighborhood list, a message forwarded from someone with a mutual friend, always with the same thin edge. Once, she arrived at a community meeting pretending to be a concerned neighbor, and then asked, in a polite voice, whether the center intended to run background checks on volunteers. Her manner was that of a person aligning herself with institutions, with order over people. Na answered calmly. Volunteers would be asked for references and for interviews, and the center would do basic checks where necessary. Trust was difficult and had to be earned. Janine's smile did not crack, but the room stiffened in a way that reminded Na that power often used formalities as weapons. The threats escalated, not suddenly, but as a pressure cooker leaks steam. An incendiary note left in the mailbox, the center's windows pelted with a string of eggs one night, a small back alley blaze that singed the siding of a neighbor's shed and made the air smell like melted plastic. None of these were singularly devastating, but by accumulation they had the effect of a slow constriction. Radio silence from Mr. Lancaster's circle suggested tacit approval on one side. The silence of the city council suggested that some fights were too local to be noticed unless someone made a louder noise. And yet the real turning point arrived on an ordinary Tuesday when someone tried to set a small fire in a trash can near the center's rear door. It was Luis, the contractor who had been helping estimate repairs, who found the smoldering pile and kicked the embers with a boot until they died. He was a man who smelled of sawdust and oil, whose hands bore the honest abrasions of work, and he behaved as if the act he had done, extinguishing a potentially dangerous blaze, were the most natural part of being a neighbor. He called the fire department, and in the daylight the mark left a blackened ghost on the brick that the volunteers scrubbed at until their knuckles ached. They left the dark line as a reminder, rubbing the edges but never pretending it had not happened. Detective Shaw Palmer took a different tack. He arrived at the center, hands in his pockets, not so much the theatrical investigator as a liaison with a worryingly long patience. He interviewed volunteers, he took photographs, and he promised to bring what resources he could. "We can't solve everything overnight," he said in his low, efficient way, "but we can make sure these things are logged and tracked. That matters." The logs, not understood, were both practical and symbolic. They made invisible patterns visible. The ugliness that had been directed at them hardened some things and clarified others. Rather than fragment the group, the attempts at intimidation made the center's bonds into a visible thing.
Teenagers who had never spoken up took turns making food deliveries for watch shifts.
Women who had been quiet in meetings stood in the open doorway with a kind of stillness that said, without melodrama, "We are here." It was in that moment of pressure that the neighborhood's contact to wider audiences mattered. Isaiah, who had been quietly indispensable in ways he did not like to make public, called a friend at a local paper and asked for a human interest piece that discussed community ownership. He declined to be named as a major donor in the piece, but the reporter, chasing a larger hook, wrote a different headline for the print run: "Billionaire helps community turn pain into purpose." The online headline ran wilder. Within 24 hours, the word billionaire ricocheted through gossip chains and comment sections. For many in Na's neighborhood, the concept was almost mythical: a man whose money could do anything, and a story that asked them to be grateful. The article produced a subtle shock. Some welcomed the attention, the possibility of drawing more support. Others bristled at the word that suggested a savior rather than a partner. Na's first instinct was to bristle. She had always been suspicious of narratives that turned people into props. But then a young volunteer, the same Lena with the bruised fingers, came in grinning and brandishing a small letter from a school district. Their local middle school had approved a partnership to use the center as an after-school space. That was small and concrete and not at all sensational. The word billionaire could be true or untrue. What mattered was what people did with whatever attention came their way. Whitman's grant committee scheduled a site visit on a humid Monday. Na prepared as if the meeting were both ritual and battle. She wrote a mission narrative by hand that explained plainly how Rise and Root would spend funds, what metrics of success they would use, and how decisions would be made by a community board. This was critical. Na insisted that any grant money come with a caveat: board seats reserved for neighborhood residents, a cap on any donor's unilateral decision-making power, and a public accountability measure that required quarterly reports. Whitman, who had been impressed with Delilah's history, appreciated the clarity and told Na he had rarely seen such firm insistence from founders. On the day of the site visit, a local paper came with Whitman. Marta greeted them at the door. Na led a tour: the intake room she had dreamed of, an after-school nook with donated textbooks, a corner for sewing and another for computer lessons. She introduced volunteers like they were family, which in truth they had become. The committee asked practical questions about staffing, about a contingency for security, about expected outcomes. Na answered in concrete terms. She did not speak in anecdotes. She spoke in plans that bore the weight of lived experience.
Whitman listened and, at the end of the visit, told her he would recommend the grant award to the board. The committee's recommendation had to pass a vote, and that process took longer than any of them liked. There were moments of waiting that felt like pause in a lungs-full-of-water scene. Then finally, a letter arrived, stamped with an official imprimatur. The grant was approved. The packet included a modest sum, instructions for how it could be spent, and crucially, a phrase that Whitman had insisted upon: a public support stipulation that required the fund to be used to fortify community governance. The day the news was made public, Na sat on the sidewalk with a group of girls and drew their names in chalk. Jada, at 9, decided the mural should include a little dog for luck. Linnea argued for a satellite of stars. Sheila traced a route and wrote her grandmother's name beneath it. The grant approval was not a solution to everyone's problems, but it made the center feel less like a fragile experiment and more like a place with permissions to expand. Opening day was organized like a careful ritual. No ribbon-cutting fanfare was desired, yet there was a need to mark the public moment. They planned a small ceremony, an early morning breakfast, a few speeches, and the dedication of one wall to Delilah, a plaque mounted beside the mural with her name and the phrase Na had written in her note: "Where girls like my mother don't just survive, they rise." The community insisted that the plaque be simple, the words chosen by vote, and the plaque would hang on nails hammered by volunteers. Mr. Lancaster did not attend. Janine sent a perfunctory note that was read aloud at the meeting like a paper star in a parade, present but not participating. There were men and women from different blocks, students in their school uniforms, and an older minister who had been Delilah's friend, and who spoke without a microphone about courage as a habit. Whitman was there, leaning back in a folding chair, a little unsurely, and Isaiah arrived in his quiet way. No entourage, just him carrying a box of donated books as if he had taken on a task he trusted his hands to complete. As speakers stepped up, something subtle and necessary happened, the narrative shaped by the neighborhood's own language, not by outside editors. People spoke about the center's practical changes, the laptops that would allow resume-building workshops, the sewing machines that would transform small skills into steady income, the counseling portion that would sit beside the tutoring, so that emotional well-being was not an afterthought. When Na took the microphone, she spoke without melodrama. She thanked people who had shown up. She named Delilah and refused to let the history be reduced to a sentimental phone note. Then she walked to the mural and, with Marta, removed the shroud to reveal the painted tree and the roots and names. Children gasped.
Someone in the crowd clapped in a way that was both loud and private. The local paper arrived with a photographer. In the photo that accompanied the print article, Na stood with paint under her nails, the plaque visible on the wall next to her, and the caption read not as a flourish, but as a summary of fact. Neighborhood Center founded by resident volunteers in honor of community organizer Delilah Brooks opens its doors. Online, other outlets ran with the Billionaire angle. Some journalists framed Isaiah as the central figure. That made some neighbors bristle. Marta, who had watched the dynamics for months, said later with a small laugh, "If you're going to make a famous person of anyone, make it the women who stayed up patching a roof." The day also tested them. Mid-morning, as people were cutting cakes and signing up for programs, a van rolled slowly by and two men took pictures through an open window. The volunteers noticed and politely asked them to leave. The men argued about press credentials and then drove off. Later that afternoon, someone smashed a display case outside a shop 2 blocks away with a brick. It was an act of vandalism not directly linked to the center, but that kind of scattered hostility had a way of threading into a narrative of intimidation. In response, Na called a community meeting that evening and spoke plainly about strategy: to document, to remain visible, to refuse fear as a primary organizer. People left feeling tired and solid. Isaiah's role, publicly, became a point of debate. In op-eds and comment sections, his name was invoked in ways that made Na uncomfortable. Some framed him as a magnanimous benefactor, others saw his anonymity as manipulative. She made a choice about the narrative. Whenever a reporter asked to profile Isaiah as a central figure, she redirected them to Marta, to Mrs. Whitlow, to the volunteers who had grown the programs. She insisted gently and firmly that the center's story not be bent to fit a hero narrative. At a small board meeting a week after the opening, Isaiah sat at the end of the table, his hands folded, and asked not to be a center director, but offered to be a named supporter and occasional board member in an advisory capacity. He suggested a small endowment that would cover operating expenses for a year, but he insisted the board be made up of local residents and that disbursement decisions be transparent. Na accepted the role he offered, supporter, not owner, and insisted on bylaws that would guard against unilateral donor decisions. There was an odd moment of public shock when a national outlet did a human interest piece and used a photo of Isaiah stepping out of his car the night Na had been thrown out of the Lancaster estate. The magnified narrative, Billionaire mistaken for driver, took Maid home, made good copy. In the neighborhood, people gossiped, some with delight at the irony, others with caution about what such a label could do to the center.
Na felt the accent of Billionaire as a kind of pressure, but not all pressure was bad. The publicity brought in volunteers from farther away, a retired teacher with curriculum experience, and an IT specialist who offered to run free classes. Still, Na kept returning to the central ethic that Delilah had embodied: listen and then act. Make decisions grounded in community, not headlines. The months that followed were a collage of small victories and necessary defenses. They installed security cameras, something Isaiah pushed for quietly after the arson scare, and the footage, when analyzed, implicated a man who had a tenuous connection to a local gang. Detective Palmer coordinated with other precincts, and after some investigations that Na could not claim credit for, the incident stopped with the arrest of 2 individuals whose motivation, the detective suggested, seemed to be opportunistic intimidation rather than political statement. The charges moved through the system. Na did not track every legal twist. She only knew that some breathing room arrived, and that the watch shifts could be relaxed without feeling like abandoning a wall. More meaningful than the arrests, perhaps, was the way students began to use the center as if it were a second home. Jada learned to type and then helped others. Linnea enrolled in a coding boot camp the center subsidized with part of the grant. Sheila, who had once sat up late folding laundry, discovered an interest in graphic design and painted a small banner for the center's website. Na watched these quiet transformations and understood that the work of dignity was not always dramatic. Often it consisted of repeatedly offering a chair and then letting people decide how to sit. There were moments of reconciliation that did not take the form of ceding ground. Janine's presence lurked in the neighborhood like a weather pattern. She never apologized publicly, never retracted the accusation that had once unmade Na in a foyer. But a year after the vase incident, Mr. Lancaster, who had been conspicuously silent, sent a short, carefully worded letter to the center, asking if they might accept a donation in honor of a late family member. The envelope smelled faintly of corporate PR. Na's reaction was private. She thought of the house with its marble and chandeliers, and the way it had offered less empathy than an Escalade parked in a driveway. She instructed Marta to accept the donation only if it came without strings, and with a note that all funds must be processed through the center's governance procedures. The donation arrived, a modest check earmarked for the library corner. Na used it to buy books in a small shelf that would hold neighborhood histories and biographies, textbooks that told different maps of power. Eventually, a front-page article in the City Sunday edition ran a piece that tried to make a tidy narrative of the events, from Maid to Movement, how one night unwound a small injustice.
The headline made some people uneasy. Stories that bracketed complex lives and before and after frames tended to flatten. Not read it over her morning coffee and then set it aside. The piece quoted several volunteers and included a photograph of Na arranging a small bookshelf. It also quoted Isaiah in a way that made the national audience do a double-take. "I was mistaken for a driver," he had said to the reporter, with a small, rueful smile. "What I did then was what anyone should do when someone is hurt. But I'm not the story. The people here are." That line, "I'm not the story," shifted something. It clarified Isaiah's role in public terms and returned the narrative focus to the community. People in the neighborhood nodded when they read it. The real shock, they said, had been not that a man with money had helped, but that he had refused to be the main event. Time, which tastes like both patience and demand, produced other reckonings. Whitman's grant renewed for another year, with conditions that allowed Rise and Root to hire a part-time program director and to subsidize transportation for teens to get to tutoring. The center expanded into a second storefront, a quiet building the owner rented at a favorable rate after a neighbor made a call, and they began to dream of a small garden in the back, a place where the mural's painted roots could meet something living. Nas supervised the build-out the way she had scrubbed brass in a big house, with an eye for detail and a refusal to let expedience flatten dignity. She insisted that the clinic hours would be walk-in and that records be kept with confidentiality. She pushed for a sliding scale and for a counselor to be available for teens exhibiting signs of trauma. She knew from the record of Delilah's work that the smallest administrative choice could have large moral consequences. A seemingly gentle policy, "Don't ask for income if someone needs help," could make the difference between a family seeking help or turning away. The community, which had been skeptical at first of any outside help, had grown into a group that could deploy resources without being merely reactionary. They organized a small board with representatives from different blocks, and they voted on issues in meetings that sometimes felt messy and sometimes blessedly ordinary. The board's composition was a small victory in civic form. People who had once been rendered invisible were now formally consulted. There were quieter moments too. Na found a small photograph in Delilah's boxes, a black and white image of her mother standing among a crowd, hand raised as if in mid-instruction. The edges were frayed. Na mounted it in a simple frame and put it on a shelf in the intake room. Children asked about Delilah, and Na told stories that were not heroic in the cartoon sense, but full of humility. How Delilah organized a food drive after a factory closed, how she taught neighbors to write cohesive complaints to landlords.
The stories became a curriculum of small insistences. On a soft spring morning, 3 years after the vase shattered a marble foyer, the city ran a feature about neighborhood-led centers. The headline used the word billionaire again in the subheading, and the piece included a small profile of Isaiah Collins. The article was more thoughtful this time, focusing on the paradox of concentration of wealth and the need for local leadership. It quoted Na. "Money can be a tool," she said, "but tools are only useful when people know how to use them." The quote circulated in circles that mattered: grant committees, city planners, other neighborhood organizers. The center received more modest donations, some from people who had read the piece and wanted to support local-led efforts, and others from nonprofits who wanted to partner rather than dominate. In the end, the shock everyone spoke about most was not about whether a wealthy man had once been mistaken for a driver. That part of the story became an anecdote in the retelling, sharp, ironic, satisfying in a headline manner. The deeper shock was watching a community take the smallest courtesy, a man opening a door, and turn it into a persistent, stubborn mechanism for dignity. Isaiah's small kindness had been a hinge, yes, but the door it opened was held up by many hands. Delilah's house, so named and registered formally, grew into something both unglamorous and sustained. The garden in the back produced a humble harvest of tomatoes and basil, and teenagers taught one another the rhythms of planting and patience. The mural, their public scripture, wore its scars as evidence. The old painted slashes were incorporated into new roots, and a small plaque beneath the largest scar read, "We remember." The girls who had once sat idly in laundromats now have laptops and mentors, and crucially, people who listen to their plans. Families whose lives had been riven by cuts of economic vulnerability found in the center someone who could help file a steady claim, make a phone call, or connect them with a counselor. Na herself became a leader in a way that married her interior humility with public responsibility. She was not unmoored by the title. She knew it carried both admiration and expectations that might make her stumble. She learned to take advice and to refuse hero worship.
She insisted that every major decision pass through the board and that every donor understand the limits of their influence. She understood that power, when used to institutionalize community control, could be a furnace rather than a weapon. One late afternoon, Isaiah came to the center and sat among the volunteers, not in a chair with a press pack at his elbow, but on a small step, elbows on his knees, listening to a teen describing her plan to study architecture.
He handed the young woman a small envelope, a scholarship that would allow her to take summer classes at the community college, and she cried, not from spectacle, but from the simple arithmetic of possibility. Isaiah's role remained ambiguous in the public imagination. Some still used billionaire with a mischievous emphasis, but among the people whose lives had been touched by the center, he had a different reality, one of steady giving and quiet restraint. There were no sweeping reconciliations without work. Na returned, one June, to the Lancaster estate, not for revenge, but because a neighborhood history project required records from local citizens. She went with a small request. Could the estate donate an old ledger to the archive? The meeting was brief and businesslike. Mr. Lancaster's assistant led her to a back office, where dust motes quarreled in the air. The ledger they offered had nothing to do with the vase. It contained notes on guest lists and household accounts. Na thanked them for the donation. She left with her dignity intact and a small, useful donation tucked under her arm. She did not expect an apology at midnight or a grand public conversion. She wanted only to ensure that the center had what it needed to do its work. Years settled like good weather. Rise and Root continued to evolve. They added a small legal clinic run by volunteer lawyers who assisted with tenant disputes, and a program for young mothers that offered parenting classes and emergency childcare. The center developed a reputation for doing the slow, necessary work of civic repair, patching, listening, teaching, and defending. The mural became a landmark. People stopped by for tours and came away with a kind of surprised humility. Visitors expected ragged despair and instead found an ordinary, stubborn competence. The final scene, if one wanted to call it that, was not a single image, but a series of small ones stitched into a single panorama. Na walking the grounds as the sun dipped, her hand stained faintly with paint from an afternoon class. Jada laughing at a joke and jogging past a painted bicycle rack. Marta counting receipts and refusing to let accounting be a mystery. Mrs. Whitlow reading aloud to a group of children under the painted tree while a small portable fan hummed. A group of teenage girls planning a mural expansion that would include names of elders whose histories had been recovered from city archives. Isaiah stood a short distance away, speaking with a contractor about improvements to the back garden, but when Na came to him, he folded up his plans and listened to an update about a grant timetable. He did not seize the moment for himself. He waited to be asked. That pattern, his willingness to accept lesser visibility, had become part of the local vocabulary of trust. He had been mistaken for a driver on a night that left Na bloody and naked in terms of social currency.
In a real sense, that mistake had become the hinge for a new kind of relationship, one in which power was used to amplify other people's voices. On a late summer afternoon, a reporter asked Na if she was surprised by the arc of the story, by how a single courtesy had rippled outward. She answered in a way that had become her way, precise and humble. "I wasn't surprised by the kindness," she said. "People do kind things. I was surprised that someone would help in a way that didn't take ownership. That's rarer." She paused. "The real shock is how ordinary courage multiplies. We planted, and the roots took." The center's name, Rise and Root, and Delilah's house live together now, one in action and the other a memory. The mural's roots reached across a wall and into the neighborhood like a promise. Na watched as girls traced the names with fingers that knew their own lines of lineage. She understood that legacy was not a ledger entry, but the slow accumulation of practices, to listen, to show up, to refuse the easy narrative that would make someone else the hero. If the neighborhood was shocked, it was not by the identity of a man who could have been labeled bill, property, or headline. It was shocked by how a small human courtesy had been turned into an instrument of sustained community power.
The man who might have been titled Billionaire in a headline had, through deliberate modesty, become a quiet ally. The shock for many was that power could be arranged to support rather than to lead. Night settled again, and the painted tree glowed under soft sodium lights. Na sat on a low step outside Delilah's house with a notebook in her lap, writing names and program notes, making lists in the methodical way she had learned from her mother. She thought for a moment of how fragile the world's stories could be if told only by newspapers. She thought of the card in her pocket that had once been a fragile promise and then had become a tool among many. She closed the notebook, rose, and walked the path between garden and mural, her shadow long and steady under the painted roots. Behind her, inside the center, a group of girls settled around a table with laptops open, the screen light painting their faces with possibilities. The mural, the plaque, the garden, none of it erased the past indignities nor the small violences Na and others had endured. But the center functioned now as a place that turned indignity into action and listening into policy. It was at once a memorial and a laboratory. On the sidewalk, a car pulled up, unremarkable, ordinary. A man who might have been a driver opened a door for an elderly woman and helped her into the shade. Na smiled to herself. The city had many small private acts that never made front pages. Some made no difference to the broader anxieties of wealth and power. But here, in this neighborhood, such acts were gathered, cataloged, and used as fuel.
They were the mortar that held a fragile, stubborn architecture in place. If you want to do more than read about it, learn how to support community-run centers like Rise and Root. These places change lives when they're led by the people who live them. Visit the Rise and Root page to learn more and to find ways to help. Na walked into the center, and as the evening settled into ordinary work, she checked the intake list, offered directions to a newcomer, and listened to a girl explain the sketch for a new mural edition. She listened the way Delilah had taught her, not to fix everything in a single breath, but to hold space until someone found their own voice. Outside, the painted roots kept their patient claim on the wall. Inside, the work continued, daily, stubborn, human, and the small shock that had begun with a mistaken identity had settled, finally, into something more durable, a practice of shared power.